My name is Chris Leak. I'm chair of the City County Planning Board. I now call to order our work session for May 26th, and I'm going to now turn this over to our planning director, Mr. Chris Murphy.
Make sure my mic's on.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes. Hello. Good afternoon. The first item on the agenda today is a continued discussion of the Winston-Salem Forsyth County Comprehensive Plan update. If you recall, we began discussing this at your April work session a month ago, and during that discussion, we kind of presented what some of our lit review and some of the things that we had found, and we had some good discussion centered around that. There were some things that we wanted to continue that discussion on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy, who can just go over a brief overview of the last few slides that we had, and then what we're going to do is continue the discussion. And at one point, we had planned on the ability to use our laptop as a white screen to continue to kind of do a facilitation where we could write things down. Is that still going to be possible through this? Okay, I wasn't sure if we were going to try to do that remotely or not, but because we're doing this as a remote meeting, at about 3:30, we found out all of our stuff had to be presented through Zoom. We couldn't have the laptop in here, so that kind of changed what we were doing. And anyway, we'll make sure to take notes, and hopefully the discussion of the other board members will prompt good discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amy.
I'm happy I didn't understand the question.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? Good.
Yeah.
We can go to the next slide. So just a little background and to refresh everyone's memory from last time. Staff spoke about how they did a literature review of 38 comprehensive plans that from various communities throughout the country. And what we looked at was both content and organization of those plans, the outreach methods that were used, and also the aesthetics. You know, did they look good? Were they legible? Things like that. And from that, we had three main takeaways, and that was, one, we want to have a shorter document, approximately 100 pages. Two, we like the use of vibrant color in the document, and also the use of quality graphics and photos. One, to sort of showcase our community as, you know, in the sort of range of individuals within our community, but also making sure our graphics are legible, understandable for the layperson, and actually contribute to the dialogue and the information within the plan, and also have clear, concise language. Make sure that it's not a lot of planner speech, that people, the average citizen, can pick this up and read it and understand it. There was 11 main topic areas that we've sort of pulled out to look at and somehow incorporate into the document, either through research or through discussion actually in the plan. And those range from equity, housing, affordability, resiliency, sustainability, livability, history, really looking at the history post World War II, sort of our urban renewal history. We've talked a lot about the Moravians and R.J. Reynolds, but we haven't really spoken a lot about our urban renewal history and how that impacts us today. Tourism was another one, as well as looking at sort of the logistics of economic development, what's needed on the ground to make economic development happen. And then also looked at and discussed key items to include in the plan, including a good executive summary or introduction, a user guide that explains what is a comprehensive plan and how does it work and how do you use it, 5 to 6 key items to include in the plan, ways to personalize the plan by including maybe quotes from the public outreach, as well as including sort of call-outs or little text boxes that include extra information to help articulate what we're trying to speak to in the plan. Next slide. We introduced our name for the plan, which is Forward 2045, and talking about the next steps would be research and data analysis, which we sort of started talking about with staff now to sort of do that over the summer. Also, we talked about public outreach, which we'll go in some more in a bit. And that will include a website. We do have a domain name set. It will be survey or surveys. And there will be formal public meetings as we've traditionally done, and those could be in person or through virtual means because we have both, and we'll probably use both. But also looking at other informal outreach methods, things like pop-up meetings, having tables at various community events, and sort of anything possible in that realm to try to get as much input as we possibly can. And then we talked about marketing ideas on how to get the message out, whether it's, using social media. I jokingly always talk about who's our next TikTok star, to having, banners on Facebook or YouTube, or using billboards or advertisements during movie theaters, just anything and everything to sort of spread the message that this is going on to get that input. The outreach will begin this fall, and we're looking for adoption in winter 2023 to spring 2024. And then we broached the topic of having the planning board be the steering committee for the plan. And then that led to some discussion as well. Next slide, please. And sort of to refresh on some of the key points that you all had last month, we had a couple recommendations. One, you really liked the idea of using color as a navigational tool throughout the plan, having the ability to use the website and the surveys on multiple devices, whether it be a phone, a tablet, a PC, a Mac, what have you. And then to build in flexibility in the plan so we can adapt. So this is not a static, set-in-stone document. It can adapt to changing environments. It can be a little bit flexible or fluid and can be updated throughout the next several years. The topic of having a separate steering committee beyond the CCPB, beyond y'all, was talked about briefly, as was the opportunities for having continued discussions. Basically, a longer outreach plan that would allow for deeper level of public involvement beyond as just a simple single meeting on a topic and then you move on to the next topic, really allowing for deeper discussions. And also the idea of having focus or stakeholder groups as a way to sort of get that deeper discussion going on, to really come up with some really consensus on how to approach these difficult topics. That's the end of my presentation. Was short and sweet, but now I would sort of open it up to y'all to sort of bring up any ideas you have, anything and everything. There's no bad idea, really. I'll answer any questions.
We thought of incentives at all for like neighborhood groups to like host like little charrettes, like not like major incentives, but like maybe like free coffee or like don't, you know what I mean? Something that we could bring like old school planning maps and like, okay, here's your neighborhood. This is what we're kind of thinking for legacy. What are your comments?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the idea of using food and public transportation to try to get people there, anything that will entice the crowd is that, but also looking at smaller groups and going into some of the neighborhoods that we may not traditionally get input from to really going out to them and saying, let's do a small, like you said, charrette.
Like a meeting in a box. Like we used to do that a lot in planning school. Like we would put everything in like a toolkit that they would need to have their own like little neighborhood charrette. And maybe it was like a $5 gift card if you were to come back with a comment card, like actual comments, like valuable comments.
And Mo, just to add on what Amy's saying while she's taking some notes here, staff definitely does plan on having swag or, we're not sure what that would entail yet. In the past, we've done things like legacy pens. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the best thing to give out. And 2022, one of our staff members actually had a good point, though. Last time we gave out the cheap pens, if we give out good pens, people are more likely to keep them, and then they'll keep seeing that logo. But we have put that request in the city budget for a pretty substantial amount, and that would also cover things like facility rentals and hosting surveys and, pizza at an event or things like that. So we're absolutely with you in that regard.
Okay. I went to the city of Oshkosh for like one of their like economic tours. I have very sad news that Oshkosh Bagosh is not in Oshkosh, so if you guys are looking for it there, don't. But they gave out like actual like nice like those sunglasses and like keep them in the car, and I think they're like great because then they say like Greater Oshkosh on the side, and they're not like awful, but if you lose them at the beach, who cares, right? But then it's also like, what is forward 2045?
had a question on the content, a couple of questions. One is, will the comp plan contain a land use map? And if it does, will it be based on the current small area plans, or will it be altered from that?
I think our idea is to really re-evaluate that growth management plan and re-looking at that. So it wouldn't, I think the uses, we wouldn't get down to the use level, but I do think the growth management plan would definitely be looked at and altered as appropriate because, that's come up a lot for us in our discussions with our plans.
Yeah, it might be a good idea to just have a meeting just on that.
Sorry. These microphones are so sensitive that if you leave them on when you're not talking, you'll tend to make noise, so I always cut it off. If we go, and again, I believe our inkling is to go towards more content-based, idea-based area plan, but certainly one of those ideas will have to be a growth management plan of some sort, because that is while there are lots of key considerations in a comp plan, to guide future land use, we've got to have that base guidance that comes out of legacy or, out of the comp plan, legacy, the last two that we've done. And so coming out of that, again, I'm not 100% sure if we're going to go area plan based, if we're going to go kind of a combination of special studies, interchange studies, those kind of things. But the underlying area plans would still, until we got in and did additional studies, a lot of that information would probably still hold, similar to the way whenever legacy was adopted in 1998, 99, that time frame. The city and county never had a comprehensive area plan approach that looked at things parcel by parcel. So until we got that base layer in place, we were using those old plans like the country club area plan, which was done probably in the early 80s. So again, the same kind of thing, we would use that as our guidance, but if there are conflicts between that and legacy, we kind of have to make those judgment calls. But as we noted last time, one of the important discussions is going to be, if the growth management plan is going to recommend going outside of the Muddy Creek Basin, where are we going to go? And that discussion will happen in the context of this, along with the water and sewer master plan that utilities is contemplating. So we all kind of have to be on the same page, but there must be a land use chapter, there must be a land use component to this comprehensive plan, or quite honestly, it will be a nice document, I'm sure, but it won't hold a lot of meaning for the work that we do.
And just related to that, I think one of the most impactful things that's going to impact our land use is the Beltway. And so if there could be some discussion, some incorporation of the Beltway into that land use plan so that everyone knows what to expect.
And again, I think that's a good point. Whenever we had, and I was talking to the chairman earlier today, when we had our internal staff discussion, obviously, the next item we have on here dealing with the work program, whenever I had the discussion with the county manager, the Beltway and those interchange studies kept coming up. And, one of the things, it's going to be a key and important consideration. One of the things that, kind of talking as a staff, when you kind of look at the lack of investment in the east, northeast, southeast areas of the city, have we as planners been inadvertently biased in some of our land use recommendations, and have we inadvertently, kind of fostered the lack of investment in the eastern part of the city through our recommendations? And, I don't think it's anything intentional. I kind of believe probably so. But with the Beltway interchange, there's those some opportunities to perhaps spur some investment and kind of spread it more evenly between the east and the west, and the kind of let the interchanges on the west kind of hold because there's plenty of commercial development already there, while there's a disinvestment or a lack of investment on the east. Again, all those things are going to be important considerations. So we have a staff have already begun discussing that. And again, I think that is going to be a very key component of that land use plan.
As far as the steering committee goes, this is the first time I've been on the board that we've done this. So in the past, have we been the steering committee? Seems like that's kind of.
So we've done different things at different times. Last time, Legacy 2030, the board effectively was the steering committee. In the legacy plan from the late 90s to the early 2000s, there was an external steering committee. And then before that, there was Vision 2005, which I believe also had a steering committee. Just as an aside, Amy has done some research on our peer jurisdictions that we've kind of benchmarked as to whether or not they use steering committees or external steering committees, and the jury is kind of out on that. We have everything from some municipalities that use, and I'll let her provide you some specific examples, but a multitude of committees versus no committee. So Amy, if you want to just share a few examples of that.
Yeah, so we have some that don't have any. Lexington is the example there where they don't use a steering committee at all. And then you have like San Antonio that had a subcommittee of the city council, a comprehensive plan advisory committee of 65 partner organizations, and a steering committee. So you have the range of those. A lot of the ones that have a steering committee, they're either fairly large or they're made up of a representative from existing boards. Someone from the HRC, someone from the Board of Adjustment, someone, and that's how they're chosen. Greenville had one that had 42 individuals on it, and it was from applications. And then, Chattanooga had one that had a technical advisory committee of staff, and then they also had a community advisory committee of cross-section of the community. Oklahoma City's, theirs was a 27-member committee, and that was mayor appointed. So some of them are range, and others, what they do, instead of having a formal steering committee, they have working groups, sort of like stakeholder groups. Richmond is an example. They had one for land use, one for transportation, one for economic development, one for housing, and then one for environment. And so they sort of focused corely on those areas as a stakeholder group or a working group. Some people use different terms. And some had both. Some had working groups and steering committees. And some had none. So it's sort of kind of what works best for the community and the approach.
Amy, I have a question and a comment. You mentioned earlier there were parts of our community maybe that were not well represented. So my question is, how do we get people educated? I talk to so many people who have no idea what a comp plan is or a legacy plan. And for us, the terms are just like everyday terminology. But for a lot of people in our community, they have no idea what we're talking about. So they don't feel like they have a voice or would even have the skill to come and have a conversation. How do we engage everyone to bring everyone at least to college level 100 on what we're discussing so they can be a part of the conversation?
My take on that is to really do as much broad range. So you're touching on different factors. You do the online surveys, you do social media, as well as using other sources. But also one thing that Matthew Burchek did when he did the bicycle plan that I thought was really well done was he took a break. Like they did their outreach and then they sort of took a step back and they said, where are we not getting information from? Where are we not getting input from? And then they did targeted outreach to those communities where they're not getting information.
Targeted such as, because when you say online and social media, even though I have both, I don't use it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like you'd do both online, you do both in person, you do both. I mean, like you do all realms because we're sort of at a mix. You have one segment of the population that doesn't do social media at all. They're still sort of old school and they like things in the paper and the traditional means of getting the word out. And then there's some that, like, if it's not online, they're not doing anything. They don't touch it. It doesn't get into their world at all. So it's touching on both of those sides of things, and then as well as being able to take a step back and go, okay, we're not getting a segment from. this geographic area where we can start reaching out to those neighborhood groups or the churches or whatever in that area to really target, or you're not hearing from a certain like demographic.
Part of the input, part of that would be, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming there was like a component that Matthew had that basically it was geo-reference. So, it's where do you live or whatever. So again, you're going to see kind of like where you're getting your responses from. So from a geographic standpoint, you'd be able to figure out where you're not getting your responses from and then try to target the areas where you're not getting responses.
I think before that, though, just to kind of piggyback on Chris's, can we do some pre-stuff? I think you did a really good job at introing, like, what is a comp plan? You showed that video. You kind of laid that educational groundwork. Before we start doing all of this, I think it might behoove us to send some of that material to these organizations so that they can be like, hey, this is going to come. So if you're interested, like, this is what it's about, so that the survey isn't the first touch. Right? The education bit, getting it to that 100 level is the first touch. And I know that's not really like our responsibility, but I think that will actually spur more engagement if we can kind of give that.
I would say it is our responsibility, but the problem is going to be the same problem that, I don't say we're going to have this problem. I think we're going to get creative and try to get around it, but how do you get folks to participate in something that they don't know about, and how do you get them to want to know about it? You know what I'm saying?
Flag.
Okay. And again, I think that's part of the issue. Again, I just went on Forsyth County Connections about a month ago, which is the new, basically, county PM magazine, for lack of a better term, where essentially they talk to different folks, like 4 or 5 different employees per segment, and talked about the comprehensive plan. And that's been out there for a month, and it's only been viewed 38 times, and I think I've watched it twice. So, again,
It ends up being sometimes the same voices, the same faces at the table year after year after year.
And not that those folks aren't important, but we need to make sure we're representative of the community. And if those folks that are there aren't representative of the community, then, again, we've kind of failed.
But I also think you have to be careful depending on the level of input you get initially. I like the idea of saying, okay, we've got input. Where do we not have input from? Let's seek out some input from that geographic area, subset, whatever. If you don't have a large sample size already, though, and you reach out to a specific geographic area group, whatever, and really encourage input, then all of a sudden, statistically, and I realize this is not statistically based necessarily, but then all of a sudden you're overrepresenting a particular segment. So I think you have to be careful. It's more qualifiable than quantifiable, I guess. You don't want to skew your numbers the other direction too much either.
That's a valid point. That's one of the things I was reading today. Again, whenever you're busy, you're trying to read stuff whenever you can. I went to the county commissioners meeting for their budget discussion, and while I was there, I was sitting there actually reading the Greensboro comp plan, and they, in conjunction with the Greensboro Association of Realtors, but it was part of it was something in association with the National Association of Realtors, did a survey that kind of, it was a kind of state of the community survey, what's going well, what's not. But again, it was statistically valid, the way they did it. So, again, that's one of the things that, again, I'm not sure how we could get on to something like that, but it would be nice to do something that truly was scientific based versus just blasting it out on social media. But again, that's something we'll have to look into.
When the key to being able to reach out, like you're talking about, which again I think is a great idea, is getting a high level of input to begin with, because then you can reach out without worrying about it completely skewing your data. So
I think one other point on that, and this came from our internal staff discussion that Chris alluded to earlier, is you all remember our 2020 Census Complete Count Committee that we brought to you before in an effort to try and increase participation in the census from underrepresented and hard-to-reach populations. we are fortunate that we've made some good connections to parts of the community that we didn't have access to previously. So our staff members who were kind of involved in that effort brought up, hey, let's use those relationships and kind of run some of this information out, because you want the information to come from organizations and groups you trust rather than just the central bureaucracy in the county you live in if you're, maybe not as attuned or entrusting of the local government. So again, that's just another way we're trying to think outside the box from what we've done previous.
Yeah, I was going to ask, did we put information in the public libraries before? Was that was a
Yes,
big
we
part?
did.
So
We
will
actually
do
had
that
little
again, and
panel
that's a kind of a
things that we
permanent
made.
exhibits, so to speak, that gets a lot of people, because I know that's where you'll see a lot of people, if you can catch their attention of why it matters to them. If you make them ask the right question in their mind, why do I care that there's a comp plan and what it does? And usually we get people here that don't know about it until there's a rezoning that they care about.
Another suggestion from one of our staff members that I think was particularly interesting was putting up materials at rec centers that have childcare for more economically disenchanted or folks that are basically don't have the free time to maybe come to a meeting if they're working multiple jobs or things of that nature, but go to where the kids are and you'll go to where the parents are, is basically what this staffer said.
One of the things we haven't talked about that just kind of sparked a thought is utilizing, well, two things. Once we get up and running a little bit more, whenever we do have zoning hearings that we have folks here for who inevitably come out for the case but generally don't participate, is there something we could give them there to kind of spur their participation, again, once we get things cooked a little fuller or further, and then, perhaps also utilize our sign-up sheets from the last few years to, also kind of, clearly you had some interest because you came out pro or con, could we utilize that information again as a resource to kind of reach out? So
This may be kind of archaic in a post-COVID world, I don't know. But you think about where can you interact with a very broad cross-section of the community. What about the fair? Doing a booth at the fair. I mean, you touch every demographic, every socioeconomic group at the fair. Assuming people continue to attend it like they did pre-COVID. And I'm always amazed, it's always like campaign season and you got the campaign booths or whatever. And you think, who in the world is going to take their time to stop and talk, to somebody campaigning? But those are always the ones that have the most people around them. So, maybe that's
It's a really good idea. That's something you should think about.
Yeah, and again, I don't know whether, whenever we were having our internal staff discussion, that's something that we talked about. And actually, we didn't bring up the fair, but we did talk about other, kind of festivals and opportunities of things that go out through, throughout the year, certainly taking advantage of those.
Yeah, I was just going to mention the same thing. Basically, all those events where people are coming out for something else to try to get that input because they're already out, and we go where the people are. I remember there was one transportation plan where they had a booth at Bowman Gray. They had a table at Bowman Gray because, a lot of people come out to those races. So, it was just, I don't know what kind of input they got, but again,
faster. Yeah. Thing needs to go faster.
But again, just trying, anything where people are, to get some input, even if it's just a short, that's the thing, with some of those videos is you got to keep them short. If it's an actual ad on like YouTube, the 5-second, ones are ones people actually watch, but most people, skip over the 30-second ones. And so you have to kind of keep it short and sweet and get to the point real quick just so that, people don't just click off of you, and go on about their day. But
Well, and before we get too far beyond some of the other things that have been said just a few minutes ago, I want to really strongly support what I think is will prove to be a real difference in terms of education. I really do not think the majority of the population gives a hoot what a comp plan is. I think they care how it impacts them. And if the message is strongly oriented toward here's what we're doing and how it might impact you, then I think you get someone's attention. If you don't know what one is, oftentimes it's because you don't care what one is until it stares you in the face, until the rezoning sign goes up across the street, et cetera. So, yeah, I just wanted to try to emphasize that. I think that's valuable.
I mean, could I have a question? There are a couple outreach places. You know, the city has an outreach to neighborhoods and an outreach to community watch, and those tend to be very wide and very diverse. And I would certainly push something toward that. But despite all of this, I still like the idea of committees because I'm interested in how do we get the innovative ideas? How do we engage the innovative entrepreneurs, the innovative developers, the innovative thought that goes on in our community? And I think it's going to take a committee that represents that diversity so that we're sure the diversity is on that committee, and then get that input out of that or a way to process some of the community input that we're getting out from all the different sources.
George, have you also thought in that regard about the wealth of recently established organizations for entrepreneurs?
Many of them.
Yeah, and I think other than at the craft breweries, that's where they are.
Any other thoughts on the process? A lot of good conversation.
This isn't directed to a process as well. I suppose it is toward the end of the input process. Maybe is where I would count this, and thinking about the 11 topic areas, which I think you've done a great job of really selecting relevant topics. No one topic lives in a silo by itself. At some point in the input process, will the process include the conversation about, does the process about environment conflict with the process, for instance, on economic development? And how do we sift through that to create an end product that isn't in conflict with itself, that lets everybody that wants to pick it apart and use what they need that they think is to their advantage?
So, Jack, I think from a staff perspective, first of all,
how do we overlay that?
That's a very good point. That's certainly something that we've done in past comp plans, is calling, as Aaron King used to say, the balls and strikes, the positive and negative aspects. But to me, that's where the implementation schedule of the comp plan comes in.
Okay.
Where you're kind of taking those disparate threads and weaving them together and saying, these are the things that as a community we're going to be working on, again, as the city, as Greater Winston-Salem Inc., as the Piedmont Environmental Alliance. I don't know. I'm thinking of just various different types of groups that could have a hand in things.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that. I think another way to avoid that is in how we structure the plan. if you look at legacy is very chapter-based. You have your chapter on transportation, you have your chapter on health and equity, you have your chapter on environmental sustainability, and they all sort of stay in the lanes of that. And they reference back to other policies as necessary. But, one of the ideas we have is really to shift that and go by sort of, Chris said content-based. You can also think about, theme-based or goal-based or, and so you have your overarching goal, and then that goal may have both elements from economic development and environment. So you start to see how things interconnect with each other, because that's everything interconnects. Nothing sort of is in that silo, and it either benefits or sort of conflicts with that goal. So, I think rearranging that plan to show how these things interconnect and try to avoid the conflicts is also beneficial.
I was going to say, inevitably, I think that's true. I think inevitably you're probably always going to have some inherent conflicts in a document that's, looking broad-based policy moving towards the future. And that's why, generally speaking, you have, a staff that will provide some analysis and provide a recommendation, and then ultimately it comes to this body who, takes the information that we provide, perhaps has a different perspective, perhaps has the same perspective, perhaps has a totally perspective different from from anything that we have, makes a recommendation that then goes on to the elected body who ultimately makes the decision based on kind of all the information that's presented. Again, I think our goal would be moving away from chapter-based to more content-based, goal-based. I think we would probably look to cut down on those conflicts, but I don't know that we'll ever eliminate them. Similar to, what George brought up last time, the meeting 2 weeks ago, where basically you kind of look at the legacy growth management area plan, and whenever you have public sewer, it talks about appropriate density being 0 to 8 units per acre, but then you also have provisions in the same book that talks about farmland preservation and talks about some of those things. Hopefully, by going more, this is our objective, this is our goal, versus just looking at everything chapter by chapter by chapter, we could avoid some of those things. But I think we're more than likely not ever going to be able to get rid of all of them.
Yeah, I think if you do, you wind up with a plan that
doesn't mean
not
anything.
really executable. It works great, in theory, sitting up on the shelf because nothing conflicts. But if it didn't conflict on some level, you guys wouldn't have jobs. We wouldn't have positions on this planning board because everything would just kind of happen perfectly. And so I agree. You want to make sure that you're not just completely at odds with each other. But I think there's something to be said too for a little bit of sand in the gears, because that's what kind of creates the discussion as you're going along with how do we reconcile these two competing priorities. So.
And we understand that no one project is going to address every goal. Right. They'll all have their own sets of goals that they're trying to achieve.
Who is going to be doing the sort of the sociological preface to this? Because that drove legacy in terms of, look, we're going to have this much population, so watch out, folks. We've got to do something. We've got to do something. We've got to do something. I remember those discussions, and it was always talking about this many people by 2020, this many people, and of course, history changes and proves us wrong, and things like that. Society has really, really changed in the last couple of years here. So who's doing the sociological prep that's going to drive sort of the thinking of where this is headed?
Staff's going to do it. We've already talked with our GIS folks to look at some of that. One of the key issues is that not all the 2020 census data is out. So we're going to have to reconcile with that and how we manage that. But looking at from different angles and bringing in mapping and overlaying things to sort of tell the story, looking at our permit data and where did those 100,000 people go, where has development taken place, where has it not over time, and sort of trying to get to the heart of it. And then, looking at how does that correlate with some of our history? Is there a link, throughout history where things have happened, just to try to show that information, but it'll be staff.
And just to be clear, staff, we're kind of doing the analysis without any expectations in mind, and we're waiting for the kind of patterns to present themselves. So we don't have that hook, so to speak, up our sleeves at this point, but hopefully we'll have that, and we can share that by the end of the summer before we start going out to the general public and the community.
How many staff hours will be involved in? Yeah.
Well, Clarence, that's a great transition to the work program. If you guys are ready to move on.
Yeah, I mean, really it is. And it's one of those things where, I mean, it will be part of the discussion of the work program. I will say, and again, I haven't actually looked at the numbers. I haven't had the time to go back and look. You know, I certainly know we had probably 10 more staff members than what we have now whenever Legacy was done in 1997, 1998. I would say probably, again, anecdotally, probably when we did the Legacy 2030 update in 2010, 11, 12 timeframe, I would say we probably had 4 more employees at that point. But our workload and our caseload and our monthly cycle was a lot less than it is now. That was also before the merger of Planning and Development Services, which has brought some other things. Obviously, from a managerial standpoint, there are a lot more fires to put out on a daily basis with just permitting. The Garys of the world, I'll just say that, I mean, like Mark Allred, some of our other staff do both zoning cases, but also do some commercial plan review. I'm just saying all that to preface it that we're busier now than we were in 2010, 11, 12. We have less staff. It's going to be an all hands on deck. Everyone's going to be involved. But with that being said, it's going to, it definitely affects the work program that's in front of you. We're light on new projects just because we know we're going to be taking a lot of time to do it. A lot of time.
A lot of time. The reason I, ask the question is, and I say this with all respect, I really do, but the Forward 4045 will be 90% the same as the current comprehensive plan. I think the end result will, because all the interests are the same. You've got you've got folks that want to develop, you got folks that don't want development. We will have changes in certain areas like affordable housing, increase in parks and recreation, certainly the changes that the Beltline, whatever that's called, will bring opportunities and challenges to those kinds of things. And I think if I were designing this and I were king, I would say, let the professionals take a swing at it. That's staff. Let the professional take a swing at it. Let planning board, who's got plenty of great ideas and know where the conflicts are going to occur, and also our own special areas of interest, modify staff's work, and then don't present that as a finished product. It's just a draft, and then go out to your, that becomes the beginning part of the process. You take it to the public then, and then you target areas that haven't been responsive in the past and things like that. I'll repeat what someone or others have said. 90% of the folks don't care at all about it. And it seems like we want to present them with our best efforts initially in the form of a draft, and then really start seeking input where we need to change things around the edges and stuff like that. But that's just one person's.
Well, that's a great segue.
Yeah, work program.
Yeah.
I'll just ask you one last thing, Chris. Has there been consideration given to, and in the upcoming budget year preparation process, is it too late, since the caseload is up, the staff level is down, the work is considerably increasing. Is there an opportunity for some one-time budget appropriations for consultants or whatever to join your team so you have more people involved with this project at the staff level?
The easiest answer to that question is yes, it's too late.
Okay.
And again, we do have some money in the budget. We also have some other funds that we probably could leverage out of our existing annual budget to perhaps look at some assistance, perhaps if we wanted to, and again, I don't know what it costs to do a survey, but if we wanted some help on a particular aspect of something, we probably could traditionally, and I think if you ask most folks who aren't consultants but are professional planners, that whenever they hire a consultant, they do as much, if not more work, advising the consultant than doing the work themselves. So I definitely don't think it's anything that we would want to undertake to have them do a large component of the project. But again, there's certainly probably some funds that might be available to assist us in a particular aspect. If it's, we need some, socioeconomic data mining that we don't have, that maybe we don't have someone on staff that can do. If we need help with formulating a, statistically valid survey, something like that, we may be able to use that, but it's definitely too late to go back and ask for money, as the city manager is releasing this afternoon the budget to council, and the county commissioner, the county manager's office just released the budget to the commissioners this afternoon. So it's definitely too late for that. And again, from a staff perspective, I don't think we would want to do that because a lot of times it is more work.
Well, and I should have used the phrase third party rather than consultant. I understand. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Board, if there aren't any additional questions, again, I think it's one of those things where we will continue to, as a staff, discuss things. We will continue. We're probably in the process of formalizing a formal staff subcommittee made up of representatives of different areas of the department. And we will continue to probably meet as a staff at least a couple times a month as a full staff to discuss things. But more than likely, what we will do is we'll continue that discussion internally. We'll continue refining things, and we'll probably continue to come back to the planning board for discussion, kind of, where we've moved the ball down the field, come back to you for additional input, kind of let you know what we're doing. That's kind of how I envision this going. And we really want to utilize this summer to do a lot of background information gathering, some research on various topics. So, with that, if there aren't any additional questions, I'll turn it over to Kirk for item number 2, which is a discussion on the planning board work program for 2022-23.
All right. Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. As we alluded to in the previous item, there's not a lot of new items on this work program that we're going to be working on in the coming year outside of the comp plan. I will go over a few things just because I think the board will find them interesting or edifying to learn that we're working on them. But as Chris said, the comprehensive plan update is going to be an all hands on deck affair. We're down staff-wise, we're up workload, but I feel really confident that the staff we have right now is probably the best group of staff we've ever had. And I really mean that. I think Chris probably will agree with that as well. I know Aaron King has said that before. So I think we're going to be able to tackle this issue. And if we need consulting or third-party help on any of the technical or data gathering exercises, I think we have some funds that we can access for that. Going down to the next item, you all obviously remember our work involving accessory dwelling units and the text amendment that ultimately did change the approval process for those in the city of Winston-Salem to a staff-based approval rather than city council special use zoning. That's a huge paradigm shift. And as a result, council asked us to kind of keep tabs on that and benchmark that and see did we unleash Pandora's box? Are we going to get 200 of these things, or is it going to be a more reasonable 20 or 30 in the next year? So we'll find out in March of 23, I guess. We'll present something to you as what we've slated at least. Certainly the downtown streetscape master plan that you all remember, Amy doing a great job working with a consultant. And again, she did a lot of the work on that as an example, but we're implementing that right now, and we hope to have that finished. It's kind of working with the city's infrastructure standards right now with engineering and DOT and people of that nature. Hope to have that done in the first quarter of the next fiscal year. Desmond, if you could go ahead and scroll down to the next page, please. One thing I'll point up on this page is those who've been on the board for a number of years remember there used to be a time when we'd bring what we called a UDO cleanup pretty much on a yearly basis, which would catch some of the glitches in language where it wasn't working out as intended, or issues that we found through enforcement, and kind of collectively fix all of those in a batch text amendment. We haven't done one of those since probably 2017 at the most recent, since we did the Clear Code project. And then we've done 16 text amendments so far that have been approved under the Clear Code. So it's time. We've got a ticker of things that we need to kind of check off that are nothing big, but for the ordinance to function its best, we need to go ahead and prepare one of those. I'll just mention the next several pages deal with things such as the Community Appearance Commission, the Historic Resources Commission, and the Public Art Commission, all of which have their own governing boards and their own work programs and policy documents. So I'm not going to go into those into detail, but those are certainly things that staff are going to have to balance our responsibilities staffing those boards and commissions while we're dealing with legacy and the zoning cases and some of the other things. All that's just to provide further justification for why we're not adding a lot of new items. Desmond, if you could go ahead and go to page 5. I think this is the last thing that I want to point out to the board on here is affordable housing is certainly something that we've talked to you all about. And in fact, I was in the Affordable Housing Coalition meeting this morning, which is of course another city agency that the Community Development Department staffs. And someone in that meeting said the national housing crisis of many years has finally caught up to Winston-Salem. And I think that's apropos because we're going to be working on an inventory of underutilized non-residential properties in the city that could be repurposed for affordable housing. That's where things have gotten in terms of kind of trying to exhaust all our options to develop affordable housing for the community. So I think that's a really interesting project and one that the board would like to be made aware of, and certainly you'll see the results of that. Beyond that, I don't think there's too many things that you haven't seen previously in this work program or in other years previously. In the past, we've given the board the option of whether they want to go ahead and make a motion for adoption at this meeting. Alternatively, if you feel like we need to add some things, or if you want to reach out to us and ask questions, you're welcome to continue this item to your public hearing in June or your work session meeting in June. But I'll leave that up to the discretion of the board if someone wants to kind of propose some direction.
Okay. Would anyone like to make a motion? You want to think it? Have you had an opportunity to read through this? Are we ready to make a motion?
This is relatively unchanged from what we received.
It's completely unchanged from what went out Friday.
Okay. I'd move approval of the work program.
We have a motion by Mr. Lamb. Second by Mr. Grubbs. Any discussion? All in favor, sign of aye.
Aye.
All right, that is unanimous.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chairman of the board, the next item on the agenda is just a debrief of the public hearing, a meeting that we had 2 weeks ago, the meeting of May 12th. Just as a refresher, I think we had 9 or 10 cases on that agenda, including the case 3529 on Somerset and F1617 out south of Tanglewood.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment and observation, really, that it seems to me like we've had several cases recently that have had challenging topography, and I think we're going to have a lot more of those. I'm speaking of the Somerset case and even the Tanglewood case to some extent because it was backed up against the park and that caused an access issue. So my observation is that I think we're going to have future issues where there is going to be access issues that affect neighborhoods, small neighborhood streets, like in the Somerset case. As kind of wondering if the staff had any suggestions about how we might deal with that. And one thing that, I don't know if this is even feasible, but it seems like the impact that the people are complaining about the most is the inability to go out and walk when they could before, where their streets were their sidewalks because they don't have sidewalks. And the sidewalk plan that we have prioritizes connecting up to existing sidewalks as how we prioritize new sidewalks, which makes areas like the neighborhood that was in that case very low on the list for future sidewalks. So just wondering if maybe we could think about maybe prioritizing those areas for sidewalks, areas that are unduly affected by topography that funnels traffic onto their roads.
I definitely think it's something we can look at. I can't remember. I believe, do we still have an item on this work program, or did we kick it to a future year that dealt with analyzing the street cross sections?
We do still have that, I believe.
I believe it would probably be a part of that discussion. So it's on your work program for next year. I believe that's something that could take part of that. You bring up an interesting, part of the problem and part of the conundrum and part of the issue is, okay, if you look at the context of that case, depending on which study and which email you look at, the Lockwood Drive is either 18, 19, 20, or 21 feet wide. I saw 4 different measurements in different things that were there, but the one thing that no one talked about or disputed is the fact that, it's a neighborhood street that probably carries 400 trips a day, and more than likely can probably carry 5,000 trips a day and it still not be over capacity, especially when you look at the context of the 16-foot wide Somerset Drive, which is designed to carry 15.6. Obviously, different types of roads with different purposes. But where I was going with that is, again, if you look at it and, some of the discussion centered on, what can we do to bring this road up to standard? And, it technically probably meets a standard that's adequate for the amount of traffic that's on it. It's just going to be a change in how folks use it. So kind of that, reconciling that with the fact that in our existing ordinance, if it's found that you are hooking into a street that is ribbon paved and you're allowed to put in ribbon pavement yourself, you're not required to put in sidewalks because it's hard to do sidewalks on a ribbon section. So you've got lots of competing interests, but I certainly think that can be part of our analysis of that in the work program over the coming year.
And Chris,
valid points.
Just to confirm, that is still on the work program. It's on page 2, and it looks like we're showing that for completion around December of this year. So we should be able to provide some thought to that fairly soon, Melinda.
And along the same lines, actually, when you decide to not connect a stub street because of topographical problems or challenges, how does staff, do they apply like it's going to cost 10% more to do the development if you if you make the connection, or how do you evaluate that? Because I'm really into connectivity because I think it spreads out the new imposition on the neighborhoods instead of focusing it. And I know there's always a cheap way to connect and there's a more expensive way to connect. And the developer is always going, of course, trying connected in the least expensive way possible, and that keeps housing lower than, less expensive than it could be.
Right. It's a delicate balancing act. Like in the context of the Somerset case, my recollection is like one of the other connections that could have been made from the east to the west. There was a strip of property that they couldn't cross, and then coming from the west towards the east, there was a stub, but I want to say it pulled right into a draw right at the floodway, right at where it drops off 50 feet. The developer was already, in the context of this project, putting in one bridge and one probably 3-section box culvert. So again, it's not anything that we necessarily analyze. When we have a question related to that, quite honestly, in this case, I think we could look at the one, obviously the one coming from the east, there's not a way to make the connection. The one coming from the west, I think we can easily, even someone who's not an engineer can say that won't work. Whenever it's kind of in that gray area, we rely on our engineers in engineering to take a look at it, take a look at whether it's feasible from a slope standpoint of what the finished grade of the road would be, even under the best construction scenarios. And if it's a slope that's greater than like 10%, a lot of times they'll say, yeah, I mean, that doesn't make sense to connect. If it's perhaps the only connection that could be made east to west or north to south, like again, if we were going back and had a magic ball or some way to see the future, and we were going back and looking at whenever developments were being done both on the east and west side of Muddy Creek along Meadowlark, I mean, I think we would have probably been better served strategically to identify some key areas to have a couple of east-west connections over Muddy Creek, as opposed to the way it is now, which essentially you either have to go to Robin Hood or you have to go to Country Club. Unfortunately, we didn't do that at that time. It's a long way to answer your question of saying, there's some cases where either the site limitations or our ability to look at it say, all right, that's not feasible. Whenever it's questionable, we ask our engineers to take a look at it.
Well, I think what you run into, a lot of what you're trying to decide is it going to be usable land for housing or not? Because if you say you have to connect and it's $1 million bottomless culvert, then it's not going to be developable. So it's more than just that. I think it's the whole big picture of where we're going and how much are we willing to, how much do we need more development, and what are we willing to sort of give up in a way in order to get that, which is more important. And then you've also got the life safety issue, like the site out at Tanglewood, where you had 2 entrances, but the majority only had one. And I don't think our rules really address that.
Ours don't. There's some stuff in the fire code that deals with remoteness, but there's actually a provision in the revised fire code that talks about remoteness. And if the developer says that's the best they can do, the fire department has to accept it. So,
yeah, I think we're just going to see more and more of this as we get less developable land that's connected to water and sewer and things that make it possible. Yeah. So you end up with the other costs that are being increased all the time, even just permits and things like that. We're going to have to probably develop things that we don't want to if it were isolated from everything else that the communities need for that.
I think the challenge too, Chris, and this is kind of one of those hidden messages I feel that is not said sometimes. Some people are just afraid that the neighborhood is changing. I'm going back to the Somerset. There were pictures of deer crossing, and I mean, we have a housing shortage, and I think some neighborhoods are afraid of what's coming. If we just kind of get to the root of it, what's coming is, what does multifamily housing mean? What does affordable housing mean for my neighborhood? So I don't know how we address that, but there are days I feel like on our meetings, I'm trying to really understand what the issue is and how to decide. Do I side with the neighborhood that wants to keep this nice neighborhood with streets you can walk on and deer panting freely, or do we disturb it and put in houses or townhomes? And I think that's a big issue that I see happening. Does anybody else feel that
No.
sometimes? I mean, it's a hidden message,
Sure.
but it's there.
Yeah.
Well, my dad used to always tell me if you looked at it but you didn't own it, it wasn't yours.
Right.
I mean, you were good neighbors, but
Right.
When anecdotally, the white-tailed deer population in the United States is higher right now than it's been in 200 years.
Yeah.
So, maybe they like development.
Yeah, there is that issue.
Yeah.
But I also think that in planning for future development, we should be thinking about problems that are going to occur and how we might best address those. And the reason I brought that up is because maybe we're not putting our priorities, we're not thinking about this as a priority when maybe we should. This is impact that I think we're going to see more and more of.
But we did things like with the PRD, that opened up more land to be developed because you could take areas that you really couldn't build on before, and you could keep your density but concentrate it, and that cut down the cost on your roads and infrastructure. But you gave a neighborhood, and we kept in place the amenities and the open space. So we've done things in our rules, I think, that help us develop more. But then we still end up with situations that are not always completely like we'd want them to be. But what's the alternative?
Well, and I would like to add, I think there's room for additional conversation as to what extent some of this connectivity, some of these actual connections are for the public good, not just for the good of the developer, and create a toolkit and a box of money that can enable both goals to be achieved. Sometimes we get faced with things that I consider to be for the good of the community that are being put on, that would currently be put on a single developer, and I'm not sure that's where I would turn for that fix.
I will say, this is the exciting work. This is why we are doing this. Last session, I think those are the meetings that they're long, I get that, but those are the meetings that have the most impact and will create true citizens in this process and create true stakeholders in the comp plan. But this is the exciting bit. This is why we moved to Winston. As the city actually develops into this dense community, we have these problems. So we're going to face them. And how wonderful was it that all of those people came out and to voice an opinion. Housing is personal, right? That's the real estate. That's personal. It's always going to be personal. NIMBY is easy. It's an easy thing to reach for.
Yep.
We have the task of kind of wading through that and seeing some of the facts and being like, okay, I totally understand that you're very passionate about this, but this, I promise, if you just let it happen, we've got your back. That there's a staff that has looked into it and is not looking to ruin your property value or tear down your neighborhood. And I think that's it, right? We have to be really secure in the people that staff our planning department because they do an amazing job. Kirk said it. We've got a pretty great team, and they're not out there to blow up the Lego pieces and be like, well, let's see if this sticks, right? So it's just going to be tough, I think, for the next couple of years until people get on board, and then we'll have buy-in, and then it'll be over, and then we'll be like, oh my gosh, Winston 5 years ago, look at Winston now.
When Amy's comment, we were talking about the comprehensive plan, about the language and legacy, and I think it was in response to George's question, and Chris's comment about people just not fearing that change. I'm one of the most probably change-averse people in this room, but it's inevitable. if you look at the numbers and you look at the forecasts, and we've been facing this now for 15 years, and to Mo's comment, it's now starting to come to fruition. Instead of it being something that in legacy it was talked about, this is going to happen, people are starting to see it happen. More people are moving here because there are more economic drivers driving more employment that causes people to need housing. And so now it's shifting from a philosophical future problem to a right now problem. And so, I don't know that it makes it any less painful for the people that don't want change, but you can wish that it weren't going to be the case all you want. That's not going to change the fact that reality is reality.
We experienced that with the cottage courts. Remember, kind of the same concept.
One thing, just to interject here, I think this board has kind of organically and collectively right now come to the same realization that staff has come to over really since the pandemic. I know Chris and I have talked about it, and forgive me because I can't remember if we discussed this with the board or not, but we've kind of reached the point where all the good, easily developable filet pieces of land, if you will, are all developed. So you all have dealt with a lot of these challenging cases, and there's going to be more to come. And we've seen the effects of this at the city council and the commissioners as well this summer, is how do we deal with an increasing population while an enhanced sense of protecting some of these resources that we now see are going away, affordability issues of equity that have become much more apparent with some of the other challenges. Maybe that's the hook is for this comp plan, is how do we address all these things in a more finite piece of land? But I think you all have really hit something here.
Yeah, I mean, it's the difference between, any community can deal with development when you've got acres and acres and acres of undeveloped farmland that you can just rezone and make housing developments. But we're at that tipping point now where do we want to be Northern Virginia or do we want to be, I don't know, Birmingham? I'm trying to think of you guys can give me better peer examples of well-planned growth, but, this is our moment to figure this out, and if we do it well, it's going to be great. If we don't, then it's going to be Northern Virginia, which nothing against Northern Virginia, just don't try to get from point A to point B.
Right.
All they want is a football stadium.
Well, and again, I think this has been a very good conversation related to, again, under the briefing of the meeting of May 12th, but again, tying back to the work program for this upcoming year and the comp plan. Because again, I think obviously the comp plan is going to be the majority of the work program, but there are going to be a few other things, and the analysis of the street cross section being one of those. But again, it ties back into the larger discussion of the comp plan and where we go. So again, I think it's been a good conversation. What I would say, or what I would ask, is, were there any other items for DB? Don't laugh at me, Jack. I'm serious. Were there any other items for the debriefing from that meeting?
I solved the connectivity problem on Somerset with the road. Once we figured out who owned that problem got solved.
No, but he said no.
Well, they just haven't put enough zeros behind what needs to happen.
As Mo reminded us, this is exciting work. So our next 9 o'clock meeting, we're all going to say, this is exciting work.
Thanks, Mo.
Thanks.
No, I guess I'm stuck with the pistachio break.
Mr. Chairman, Board, if there aren't any other items there, I will move on to staff report, and I do have several things there. Kind of update of something we've discussed in here, but I'm going to tell you the 3 items that are moving on to committee for additional discussion before City Council. The fertilizer manufacturing C subset as a result of the Winston Weaver fire. We went and talked to the committee back in April. They asked us to bring back some potential language for them to review, to give us further direction, to go back and actually formulate the language, run it through the process, which will eventually come back to this board. But what they ask us is is to examine our peer cities, look at some perhaps minimal acreages for this type of use, looking at enhanced setbacks on the property for the actual facility to provide in a little, to build in a little more buffer, and then also to bring it to where all of these uses, the subset of manufacturing C of agricultural chemical manufacturing, would require an elected body special use district rezoning. So we've kind of done that research. We've come back with some perhaps some draft language that will go to them in committee, and then if they tell us to move forward, it will come. We'll actually prepare a text amendment and bring it to a future work session for the planning board to review and provide you with all that background as well. Two other items that our staff have going to committee in June. We have the Salem Parkway public art. There was a request for proposals that was sent out back in the spring for public art installation at the intersection of Peters Creek Parkway and Salem Parkway, and also Church Street right outside the Bryce A. Stewart building, and trying to do public art and kind of tie those two things together, looking at the city of arts and innovation. Anyway, there is an item that's going forward selecting or recommending a selection for that will be going to committee in June. And then finally, on items going to committee, there was a local historic landmark request for the Haynes House, which is located at 524 North Hawthorne Road. That went to the HRC. HRC unanimously recommended approval of that local historic landmark, and that will move to council committee and then on to their full vote sometime more than likely after the summer break. The other few things I have under staff report, again, keep in mind, Desmond went over your June caseload. At this point, we still have 3 zoning cases and 3 subdivision / planning board review items for your meeting in June. Kind of following the housing theme, City Council has a stated goal of creating 750 affordable housing units per year over the next several years. I'm not sure what that sunset is, but certainly we need housing, but we also need truly affordable housing. As part of that, both the mayor pro tem, and council have asked planning staff to do something similar to what we do for our development dashboard, but for housing, creating a housing dashboard that looks at the number of overall units that the city approves. So whenever we approve a subdivision or a planning board review for a planned residential development, we approve a rezoning request. Those numbers would go into our overall housing unit number that we've added. In other words, we've approved them. We can't help if they get constructed, but they're approved on the record. And then also looking at the number of affordable units that the city council has committed funds to. So that's something that we'll be creating the end of June, looking at the first 6 months of this year, and then we'll do that monthly towards the end of each month, so that we know what's been approved through this board, we know what's been approved through city council at their zoning meeting, and we know what's been approved at their second meeting of the month, which is generally whenever they approve funding for requests such as affordable housing and other things. So be on the lookout for that. We'll certainly share it with the planning board as we send those out monthly.
Chris, sorry.
Yes, sir.
What's going to be the definition? I know what affordable housing is.
And I would have to go back and again, we're still in the infancy stage. It's my understanding it's 80% AMI is what we're going to be reporting as far as the number of affordable units that the city has committed funding to.
Okay.
At least 80 AMI. It could be 50% AMI. It could be, but it has to be under that 80 or under that the city's committed money to. The final item that I have is just and again, I'll also bring this to your attention when we meet in a couple weeks, but there is another historic marker unveiling for the Boston Alta Vista neighborhood. This was a pioneering African-American suburb in the 1920s is when it was originally platted. There was an addition to it in 1945. This is actually a privately funded marker that was purchased by the Paisley Alumni Association. That marker unveiling will be Friday, June 17th at 1, and that will be located at 818 West 25th Street, so up close to University Parkway, north of
What's the address again? I'm sorry.
it's 818 West 25th Street.
Thank you.
And I can't remember the side street I'm trying to reference. Anyway. So, Mr. Chairman, Board, that's all I had under the staff report.
All right. Is there anything else for the good of the order? A motion to
All right.
adjourn?
We'll have our motion to adjourn.
Second? Second, all right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We're back in,
Yeah, and I'm sorry, and I did neglect to say that, and I should have had that on there. We will be back in the Bryce A. Stewart Building beginning at your zoning meeting in June on the 5th floor in the Arnold King Room.
Are we gonna have something like this there? I'm not comfortable. I'm just checking.
I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people want to get out of here. I mean, again, I think we all respect COVID, but I don't really like being in these little mouse traps.
I want